Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait for a few more seconds before getting started. Thank you for your patience. Okay, we'll just get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you very much for joining us today in this webinar on climate resilience in the classroom, embedding the education sector in NAP processes. My name is Chi Pham, and I'm the Peer Learning Officer and co-author of the Education in NAP Processes report, and I'll be moderating today's session. The integration of education sector in NAP processes is becoming more of a priority. Last week, the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies and its 16-member organizations released a statement calling on governments and other actors to ensure that education is prioritized in national climate action strategies, such as the National Adaptation Plans, or NAPs. So it's a great and timely opportunity to have this discussion today. To get us started, here are a few housekeeping points. Today's session will be about 15 minutes long, including a Q&A section at the end. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself by typing your name, affiliation, and where you're joining from in the chat box. We will also be recording this session and will share the video and slides with the participants as a follow-up. Simultaneous translation or interpretation into French and Spanish is available. Please use the interpretation feature in the toolbar of Zoom to switch your language option. If you have any questions, comments, or technical issues, please let us know in the chat box. Our colleague Zara will be glad to assist you. Today's webinar is brought to you by the NAP Global Network and Save the Children. In case this is your first time joining one of our events, as a brief introduction, the NAP Global Network was created in 2014 to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. To achieve this, the network facilitates South-South peer learning and exchange, supports national level action on NAP processes, and we aim to generate, synthesize, and share knowledge on effective, inclusive national adaptation planning. Our co-host, Save the Children, is the world's first and leading independent children's organization. Save the Children is proud to work with children, their communities, and partners worldwide, discovering new solutions to help ensure that today's most vulnerable children survive, learn, and are protected. Every year, Save the Children reaches millions of children in more than 110 countries through its life-changing work. In today's webinar, we'll dive into a presentation on our new report, Education in NAP Processes, looking at key findings and insights. Then we'll hear from an exciting panel of speakers, all of whom bring different perspectives to how and why education can be integrated into NAP processes. We will then have time at the end for questions from the audience. Now I'm pleased to introduce Jen Merriweather, Education Specialist with the NAP Global Network, seconded from Save the Children, and lead author of our recent publication on how to integrate the education sector in NAP processes. Jen will present some of the key findings on education sector integration and child and youth inclusion into the NAP process. Over to you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here to present on our new report, Education in NAP Processes. So in my presentation today, I will first of all explain why we should strengthen education sector integration in NAP processes. Secondly, outline the key findings from our new Education in NAP Processes report that we can learn from in order to do this. And finally, leave you with some key recommendations based on our findings. To begin, I'll talk about the reasons why we should strengthen the integration of the education sector into NAP processes. What are the benefits to the education sector and children and youth? And what are the benefits to adaptation planning and resilient development? We need to adapt education systems because each year millions of children miss out on their education directly because of climate shocks. We've seen this last month where thousands of schools were closed in the Philippines due to the impact of Super Typhoon Nando. Earlier in the year, South Sudan closed all schools for 2 weeks due to a heat wave. Climate change also indirectly impacts children's education. Climate shocks increase the risk of malnutrition, disrupt livelihoods, and increase the risk of child marriage and child labour, all of which keep children out of school. These impacts aren't felt equally, with girls, children with a disability, and other marginalised groups of children disproportionately impacted, exacerbating inequality. At the same time, education is critical for resilience building and a country's future, and it helps to build the adaptive capacity of children and their communities. It is an investment in the leaders of tomorrow as well. Every climate negotiator, scientist, and policymaker is where they are today because of education. Education empowers, builds agency, and provides children and youth with the tools they need to drive adaptation. Schools also provide broader benefits and are at the heart of communities. They are vital for accessing critical services such as child and maternal health care, nutrition, and child protection, among others. The case for adapting education systems to the impact of climate change is clear, and it's an investment that will pay dividends for children, communities, and future generations to come. Through the NAP process, countries identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adapting to climate change, and it therefore presents a strategic opportunity to integrate the education sector. This has the benefits of, first of all, articulating a national commitment to the adaptation of the education sector, which is so vitally needed. Secondly, ensuring that the adaptation of the education sector is aligned with national adaptation priorities and the priorities of other sectors. And lastly, it increases opportunities for climate finance to address adaptation finance gaps and fund education adaptation priorities. The NAP Global Network and Save the Children's Education and NAP Processes report, with funding support from Global Partnership for Education and Irish Aid, explores how countries are starting to prioritise the education sector in their NAP processes. We analysed 62 multi-sectoral maps that were submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, before 30th of June 2025, and 106 Green Climate Fund readiness proposals for their inclusion of education and children and youth. To assess the inclusion of education, we looked at curriculum and teacher training, and this included integrating climate change into the curriculum, resources and training to support teachers, as well as Indigenous learning and teaching and non-formal education for children. We also looked at resilient school infrastructure, which includes the adaptation needs of existing and planned school buildings, school grounds, and other education infrastructure. And finally, school safety and continuity, by which we mean continuous access to education for children and youth in the face of climate shocks, and ensuring the safety of learners, teachers, and other education-related staff. We also looked at enabling factors such as data, knowledge and communication, institutional arrangements, and finance. To assess the inclusion of children and youth, we looked at their positioning in the NAP document and reference to their rights, as well as evidence of their participation and communication with them in the NAP process. So I'm really excited to share some of our findings today. First of all, 98% of NAPs mention education and 84% include an education-related priority or action. 73% include an educational priority or action that is specific to children's education. This is great news and demonstrates a growing acknowledgement of the importance of the education sector in the adaptation process. Even though many NAPs include an education-related priority or action, we found that only 40% of NAPs consider the education sector in the impact, risk, and vulnerability assessment. I wanted to touch on how countries assessed risk and vulnerability to climate change in the education sector, as there were a couple of trends. So first of all, some countries considered education as a factor that impacts vulnerability or as a factor that contributes to adaptive capacity. A few countries considered the vulnerability of school infrastructure, and some made general references to school disruptions due to climate change, with a few acknowledging the gendered impacts of these disruptions. And finally, a few also considered safety risks to students and teachers during disasters. As less than half of NAPs included education in the impact, risk, and vulnerability assessment, this does highlight an evidence gap when it comes to understanding the impacts of climate change on the education sector. With 84% of NAPs including an education-related priority or action, we also looked at the nature of these priorities. What did they focus on? We found that NAPs prioritize curriculum change, and this speaks to the recognition of the importance of education in supporting children and youth to develop the skills and understanding they need to adapt to climate change. However, NAPs often overlook resilient school infrastructure, school safety, and educational continuity in their priorities. Gender equality and social inclusion can also be strengthened across education priorities, with very few NAPs considering gender and disability inclusion in resilient school infrastructure, for example. This finding highlights the need to consider the adaptation needs of the education system more holistically, as the success and long-term sustainable impact of curriculum initiatives really depend on climate-resilient school facilities and school continuity planning. In terms of institutional arrangements, we found that 58% of NAPs include the Education Ministry as an implementing actor, but very few include a role for them in other areas such as planning or coordination. With many NAPs including an education-related priority, this suggests a disconnect between those developing education priorities in the NAP process and those responsible for implementing them. Strengthening this link is essential if education is to move from being mentioned in principle to being fully integrated in the NAP process. There's also a significant gap when it comes to costing education adaptation priorities and actions. International funders are increasingly interested in financing climate resilient education strategies, and NAP processes are therefore a strategic opportunity for the education sector to access climate finance. Accurate costings are an important step to this. We also found that there's a gap in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and learning for education, with only 34% of NAPs including education-specific indicators. Without this, countries will be missing the evidence and learning about what works in adapting education systems. So this is also a key area to strengthen. Finally, in relation to child and youth inclusion, most NAPs mention children and youth, and over half acknowledge their capacity as agents of change. However, only 27% of NAPs included evidence that they consulted with children and youth or their representative organisations in the development of the NAP. Involving children and youth or their representative organisations in NAP processes will help ensure their unique priorities and needs are heard and addressed. So, what are the implications of these findings? Where to next? For NAP teams, we recommend that first and foremost, involve and coordinate with the Education Ministry at all stages of the NAP process. We recommend including the education sector in the impact, risk, and vulnerability assessment, and I've shared some of the ways countries have approached this earlier. Use this evidence to strengthen the integration of the education sector into NAP priorities. When prioritizing education adaptation measures, consider all components of a climate resilient education system. This includes, but is not limited to curriculum initiatives. And to support implementation and address adaptation finance gaps in education, we recommend costing education priorities and actions. And for education ministries, we also recommend that you strengthen collaboration with NAP teams. Find out where the NAP process is at in your country and work with the NAP team to define a clear role. We also recommend that you be a strong voice for the education sector on adaptation through engagement and coordination with a range of education actors, such as local education groups, the education cluster, teacher unions, and civil society, as well as children and youth. And finally, it's important to ensure alignment between the NAP process and education policy plans and budgets. This means sharing current education adaptation priorities with NAP teams, working with the NAP team to budget and develop funding strategies for these priorities, and ensuring gender mainstreaming in climate-related education policies and plans. We're seeing great progress when it comes to considering the education sector and NAP processes, but by strengthening coordination between NAP teams and education ministries and addressing some of the other key gaps that our report highlights, we can work towards fully realising the benefit of the education sector integration into the NAP process in order to protect the lives, well-being and education of children. So that's it from me. And now to bring to life these findings, I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers. First of all, we have Chanel Lyons, Chief Corporate Planning Officer, Ministry of Education in St. Lucia. Chanel will be sharing her experience in leading the development of an education sector adaptation strategy and action plan in St. Lucia. We have Humaira Jahanzeb, National Technical Advisor at UNEP in Pakistan, who will share her experience of integrating the education sector in Pakistan's NAP. And we have Sarah Beardmore, Strategic Partnerships and Capabilities Team Lead at the Global Partnership for Education, who will share the importance of integrating education into NAP processes for climate smart education systems. Thank you, Humaira, Chanel, and Sarah, for joining us today. It's really great to have you here. Sarah, we might start with you. The Global Partnership for Education has been supporting countries through the Climate Smart Education Systems Initiative to build the climate resilience of their education systems. So, what makes an education system climate resilient, and why does it need to be considered in the NAP process?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks so much for having me here. It's so awesome to see this report out. Well, I think one of the things that we need to recognize that education systems were largely built during a period over the last century of much greater climatological stability. And as our planetary systems, from hydrological cycles to intensifying weather patterns, as they all get out of whack, frequent climate disasters are now the conditions under which education systems must operate. So for children, climate change is a threat multiplier. It drives up the risk that children don't have access to safe and sustained learning opportunities and throws their entire environment into chaos. Now, if they're lucky, most children actually get to spend their childhoods in school. And so a climate resilient education system is one that is able to play a pivotal role really in preventing risk, in reducing risk and managing risk, and really safeguarding children and other education stakeholders like teachers. So schools are a place where kids spend their childhood, and if they're safe, then they have a safe childhood. Now, education systems can also build the capacity of all actors in the education system to prevent, prepare for, and respond to, and even recover from the risks facing communities. And the biggest test of a climate resilient system is one where, if it's able to ensure educational continuity, especially for the most marginalized when climate disruptions occur, then you know that it's really climate resilient. So education also needs to provide an education that enables the realization of other rights. So ultimately, a climate resilient education system is one that provides relevant values, knowledge, and skills for the future. It protects children, it enables communities to build their capacity for resilience, and ultimately helps learners to make progress amid all of the planetary, economic, and social shifts that the current century brings. Now, why education should be included in a NAP? I think in the context of national climate adaptation planning, governments have to include education first because it's one of the most climate vulnerable sectors. And we'll probably hear from Humaira, but in Pakistan, over 2 million children's education was affected when flooding occurred in 2022. And over the past 20 years, at least 75% of extreme weather events impacting 5 million people or more led to school closures. So school infrastructure is vulnerable, schools are used as evacuation centers, and they're absolutely at the front lines of the climate emergency. But then secondly, children are uniquely vulnerable to climate change. So the rapid brain development, physical growth, those are acutely sensitive to environmental disruptions, meaning that climate-related stressors can trigger really detrimental effects that actually cascade throughout the lifetimes of children. Faster respiratory rates, they have immature immune systems, faster dehydration rates, less capacity for thermoregulation. These all combine to make children, especially the youngest, incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate. So if we want to ensure not only that children are protected today, but also that their development for the future is protected amidst all of the uncertainty we're facing, we really can't miss out on education. So ultimately, there's literally a positive effect between a climate resilient education system and the ability for countries to be resilient to climate disasters. And so ultimately, education is not just extremely vulnerable, but also an incredibly powerful driver of community resilience, and one that we really can't omit from climate strategies, including national adaptation plans.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such a great explanation of the need for education in that processes and that case for both education and climate policies and plans. Chanel, I think we'd love to hear from you around your experience as part of the Ministry of Education in St. Lucia. St. Lucia identified education as a priority sector in their NAP process and is currently developing an education sector adaptation strategy and action plan, or SASAP. Can you tell us a bit about the rationale for focusing on education as a priority sector and the process of developing the SASAP?
Yes, good morning, and thank you so much, Jennifer and Sarah, Umera, and everybody on. That's fortunately our Department of Sustainable Development, St. Lucia, very early on in the St. Lucian experience, the education sector was roped in from the onset, even with respect to the initial from the beginning of the national adaptation plan process. I say, hats off to our Department of Sustainable Development, very big on the stakeholder engagement, the involvement, enabling the participation, and appreciating in particular education. In our context, the Caribbean together with Latin America, in fact, UNICEF, as of 2021, would have pointed out that 9 out of 10 children in the Caribbean and Latin American region combined are expected or are exposed to at least 2 climate and environmental crises. And what are the implications of that? That exposure directly affects schooling paths and learning outcomes. And even within the Caribbean region, as we speak, perhaps all of us in this webinar session are aware of what has recently happened in Jamaica. Hurricane Melissa. And so we can appreciate how major storms and even major storms are even major crises. The latitude, the extent of devastation, the disruption, in the lives of everyone, and of course, as it pertains to children, education, learners. We cannot begin to digest how traumatic the impact of climate-related disasters, the impact that these disasters, of course, have on us psychologically, psychosocially, emotionally, etc. Coming back to, of course, the education sector rightfully being very much brought on, and even now, with respect to advancing the national adaptation process, we have had the opportunity to date to develop an education sector adaptation strategic action plan, the SASAP, which of course, is it's a real mechanism for translating the action conceived in the National Adaptation Plan. So St. Lucia has a National Adaptation Plan spanning the period 2018 to 2028, and to realize that our SASAP, of course, in the unfolding of our national adaptation process, puts in a major plug for providing strategic, and when we think of the planning guidance, the strategic guidance to the education sector to effectively transfer the knowledge of skills needed. And that speaks to empowering people, empowering learners, empowering everybody. So that St. Lucia, of course, is better positioned to act, to adapt to climate change through climate adaptation measures that are included in our SASAPs, so that we are able to harness the opportunities of a low carbon transition. And yes, with respect to our way of living, from making our earning our livelihoods to even recreation. We see how education is so important for that transfer of knowledge and skills to really effect a mindset, a mindset change, to effect a paradigm shift in the thinking, to get everybody on board with respect to how we intentionally act in keeping with climate adaptation efforts towards building our resilience and, of course, strengthening, enhancing our climate resilience capacity. And so the education sector, from the onset of the NAP, the education sector has been roped in, and very grateful that up to this point, of course, our Department of Sustainable Development has spearheaded the effort, but hats off in terms of recognizing how the space has been created. And so, of course, with education being very proactive and very pleased with this opportunity, we see how, in fact, the linkage, of course, with respect to, even at this time, other climate adaptation initiatives that are ongoing in St. Lucia, we can appreciate how our SASAP efforts dovetail, align with those other efforts. And so we look forward to the continued working experience. Our education sector plan, our more recent education sector plan, in fact, thankfully, we are grateful for the way the education sector plan made possible, of course, through the Global Partnership for Education System Capacity Grants, working in, of course, close collaboration with UNESCO IIP. We see how the very education sector plan drafting process included a team of climate specialists in addition to gender specialists. And we see how, again, all of these efforts, they come together to allow for a more targeted approach, that we move in the direction of climate adaptation for strengthening our climate resilience in St. Lucia.
Thank you so much, Chanel. It's so fantastic to hear about that experience and how education has been, included and centered in the process. Thank you so much. Humaira, we might come to you. Pakistan's NAP has a strong focus on gender, youth, and social inclusion. A couple of highlights include a focus on integrating gender and social inclusion into climate change learning materials and recognizing that girls face higher barriers to education access after climate shocks. From your perspective, why is it important to consider gender equity and social inclusion when integrating education adaptation measures into NAPs?
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hello, Sarah. Hello, Chanel, and to all the viewers. So first of all, I'd like to thank the NAP Global Network and Save the Children for organizing this very important session. And it is indeed a pleasure to share Pakistan's experience. So in Pakistan, the National Adaptation Plan, education does fall under the human capital priority, with gender, youth, and social inclusion as cross-cutting themes. Now, this focus stems from very hard-earned lessons from the recent, climate catastrophes that Pakistan has faced. And my colleague Sarah also mentioned the 2022 floods, which, they devastated Pakistan, the whole of Pakistan, but primarily Sindh and Baluchistan, the two major provinces of Pakistan, were really devastated. And, besides the devastation to general infrastructure, more than 26,000 schools were damaged or destroyed. And this disrupted learning for over about 2.4 million children. And within these 2.4 million children, there was, more than 1 million were girls. Many of these girls, they never returned because of displacements. They never returned to schools. And in several flood-hit districts, child marriage and gender-based violence increased. Of course, poverty, insecurity, it forced families into harmful coping strategies. If we recall the statistics, UNFPA estimated around 650,000 pregnant women and young girls, out of which 70,000 were to deliver the very next month in the aftermath of the floods. And of course, they faced barriers to education due to displacement. There was stigma attached. There was a lack of health services. Similarly, there was, children with disabilities, people with disabilities were among the most excluded from education during the floods of 2022. And then just recently, we've had the 2025 floods in Punjab, which have again disrupted education, with more than 3,000 schools reported as partially or fully submerged. And all of this shows how climate impacts repeatedly deepen existing inequalities, especially for girls and vulnerable groups. So empowering women educators through training in climate adaptation, health, psychosocial support, of course, it strengthens educational continuity. There's no doubt about that. Now, in response, the government of Pakistan, through the Ministry of Climate Change and Environmental Coordination, it has institutionalized a national coordination mechanism which brings together key ministries, including the Ministry of Federal Education and Professional Training. This is to ensure that education-related adaptation measures are implemented across the country. Now, under this framework, like you said, the NAP does promote school safety, emergency preparedness plans, retrofitting schools as multi-purpose shelters. There's gender-responsive wash facilities, teachers training, and psychosocial support. So I joined the NAP team it's about a year ago that I joined it, and currently we're taking stock of the progress on implementation with the provincial governments and the education departments to assess how these measures are translating from policy to practice. While the NAP is approved for Pakistan, the project is also currently working on developing district adaptation plans in the vulnerable districts in the key provinces of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Punjab. So social inclusion and gender is a key consideration in the development of these adaptation plans. And of course, then there's matters of strengthening data on disability and adaptation. Pakistan, as you know, is it's a diverse nation. We have every province has its own distinct identity, culture, norms. So within the development of these district adaptation plans, it is extremely important to also consider, customized solutions and favorable entry points for, depending on the district and the location itself, and what kind of customs and norms exist within that area. But of course, what really needs to be ensured is that gender equality and social inclusion, they are central to adaptation, and they're not, a side subject, and they're not peripheral. It is extremely important to realize that when girls are in school and when women's dignity is protected, communities recover faster. So education in that sense is both, it's a pathway to empowerment and a pillar of climate adaptation. And in Pakistan, we're ensuring that we consider this throughout the development of the adaptation planning and the measures that we have within the NAP. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your answer. That was really interesting to hear. Sarah, we've talked about the education sector priorities in NAPS, but budgeting and financing to implement these priorities is critical. Could you talk a bit about the different funding sources that education ministries and NAP teams might explore to support the implementation of education climate adaptation priorities and the benefits of this?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the question of resources is really fundamental to whether the level of ambition in a national adaptation plan can be achieved. So I think first it's important to say that the foundation of sustainable financing lies first in domestic resources. So we need to support a credible fiscal dialogue between ministries of education and finance, really embedding education in the fiscal architecture that governs all of the national spending choices. So that's first and foremost. But obviously, there are also national and cross-sectoral planning and budget strategies that ministries of education need to be a part of and can look beyond the education budget. For example, education directly contributes to climate adaptation and resilience. So national climate funds or green investment strategies could include education components, related to climate literacy, school infrastructure resilience, green skills development. Social protection platforms, for example, may also fund school feeding, early childhood, or girls' education interventions. So I think it's really important that we first recognize that really sovereign budgets are the primary source of financing for the education sector. But we also know that fiscal space is shrinking, and education is vastly underfunded. So I think ministries and NAP teams must also look to the multilateral climate funds, bilateral mechanisms, private sector, and other flows of climate finance to help co-finance education strategies. So while we see that the total flows of climate finance are increasing, the education sector is still one of, if not the least engaged in accessing climate finance, and we really need to change that story. A growing number of climate finance projects globally are including some elements of education, but they're primarily focused on knowledge and understanding climate change among a target population, rather than this broader review of really looking at the sector as a whole as a part of a path to climate resilience. We actually have just established a partnership with the Green Climate Fund, and we're starting to see an increasing interest as a key funding mechanism of the Paris Agreement to invest in education strategies. So for us at the Global Partnership for Education, we're really excited to be co-financing climate resilience and adaptation efforts in Tonga, South Sudan, and Cambodia, and then supporting the development of a pipeline of climate finance in other countries where they're keen to co-finance education with climate funds to improve the resilience of their systems. In addition to the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest mechanism, I think they mobilized over $12 billion in their last replenishment in funds that need to be allocated between 24 and 27. But the Adaptation Fund is also created under the UNFCCC to finance climate change adaptation. And they so far have invested over 1.2 billion in over 180 projects and programs since 2010. So again, another significant fund. I think it's also important to note that the bank group and the multilateral development banks are a huge source of climate finance. In fact, the World Bank is the largest multilateral financier of climate action. In 2024 alone, they provided over 40% of total climate resources. It was like $42 billion in climate finance. So helping the World Bank group to increase the level of co-benefits that they're designing into their education programs and really ensuring that there's a strong climate resilience component for all of their education investments is key. Just to note, the regional development banks, I think in particular, the Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, even the African Development Bank, and funds like the Nordic Development Fund are also addressing climate change in really significant ways. And those can actually be mobilized for the education sector if we can make the case strong enough and if education is reflected in national adaptation plans. I would mention bilateral aid. We do know it still has a role to play, even though it's reducing. And also, while many point to the private sector, which is an increasingly important actor in climate finance, 95% of their funding is really spent on bankable mitigation projects that have clear financial returns. And so we're not seeing a huge amount invested in public goods like education. But the other thing I think is, as we experience the kind of global economic pressures, we have a number of innovative finance instruments that I think could be deployed for resilience, but really have yet to be widely tested. So we need to be looking at the increasing role of debt swaps, sustainable bonds, diaspora bonds, impact bonds, blended finance of grants and concessional sovereign loans, or even targeted fiscal measures at the national level, like sin taxes and other levies on various goods. So I think while we have a huge role to play in mobilizing financing from a number of sources, it's key that we structure all of this finance in an aligned way. And that is really the operational spine of sustainable financing for climate resilient education. We need to ensure that domestic, concessional, philanthropic, private funds are all strengthening and not bypassing country systems. So we'd like to see education integrated more and more into, country climate finance platforms and really as part of joined up strategies that look to allocate financing appropriately to the purposes for which they're going to be best deployed. I'll stop there. This is already a lot.
No, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great answer. And yeah, really great to kind of hear about the breadth and range of financing available, but also the importance of that coordination and alignment. So thank you for that. Chanel, one of the gaps that is highlighted in the report is coordination and institutional arrangements between education ministries and NAP teams. You've already spoken a bit about this in your first answer around the really strong working relationship and coordination between your team and the NAP team. But can you tell us what has supported you to engage in the NAP process? What has worked well? And if I can just maybe, I'll be a bit sneaky as well. We've got a bit of a question in the audience as well in terms of how the National Adaptation Plan in St. Lucia speaks to previous work done as part of the Caribbean School Safety Initiative as well. So maybe you could talk about what's worked well and how the SSAP process is built on work that's come before as well.
Yes, thank you for that, Jennifer. Well, of course, St. Lucia is indeed grateful, the government of St. Lucia, for, of course, the Green Climate Fund Readiness and Preparatory Support Program grant, having, of course, provided resources in a very real way to have allowed for St. Lucia to pursue developing, and of course, by virtue of the SSAPs, we are even more looking forward to implementing in a very real way for true the various measures that will allow us to strengthen our climate adaptation, our resilience capacity. As a small, vulnerable Caribbean states prone to so many different hazards, that in itself, appreciating our survival, I mean, a 1.5 and over rise of the ocean would just spell total disaster. And so we can relate, St. Lucia can relate to, of course, the implications of not pursuing climate adaptation, capacity building. Our survival depends on it. And so with respect to the institutional arrangements, of course, we have recognized, again, Green Climate Fund. We have Save the Children, who are also on GPE in terms of the various grants, World Bank, GPE, that's our partners, external partners, and then locally, regionally, globally. It is so necessary, that coordination and alignment across various levels. That kind of coordination and alignment is key to strengthening institutional arrangements so that we are able to structure our efforts And, as Sarah, for example, would have pointed out, all the more recognizing the importance that our efforts come together and our efforts support, that one effort, as it were, supports the other, as opposed to an effort duplicating another or bypassing another. It is so important that coordination and alignment that the strengthening of institutional arrangements speaks to is important. With respect to the Caribbean School Safety Initiative, in fact, it was only in September, for instance, in keeping with Climate Smart Education Systems Initiative, which is yet another grant that is being implemented, activated at this time. It allowed already from the very first workshop held in Grenada in September that, of course, we continue to push, as it were, in keeping with our objectives for evidence-based policy and planning, for the requisite teacher training, curricular, pedagogy, oriented efforts. And even with respect to curriculum, St. Lucia has been undergoing curriculum, and more recently, for instance, there is a digital harmonized primary curriculum, which is not just of St. Lucia for St. Lucia, but recognizing that that curriculum reform is at the level of the Eastern Caribbean, which is a sub-region of the wider Caribbean. And then, of course, we can appreciate how the coordination, finance, when we think of infrastructural resilience, school safety, coming back to our school safety initiative, which also allows for us looking forward to adapt as relevant to our various contexts, the Model School Safety Program. We have the likes of CDEMA, our Caribbean Development Emergency Management Agency. And, CDEMA in particular, having to, again, collaboratively working with Caribbean member states would have eventually been able to put forward the Model School Safety Program, which in fact was very much influenced by best practice in the British Virgin Islands. So we could see how, the learnings, the various learnings from each other in terms of our, best practices. We see how that kind of these various learnings as well too are also important and they do give impetus to strengthening our institutional arrangements. So with respect to the Caribbean School Safety Initiative, we can see how that effort is continuing. There is a lot of work in progress, and of course the coordination and alignment is critical to structure that work, that it remains targeted, so that we are able to realize the outcomes leading to adoption of measures for strengthening our climate adaptation capacities, our climate resilience building capacities. And of course, when we think of education for sustainable development, we think of disaster risk reduction, we think of climate change education, we see how, again, the education sector, working with everyone, when we, again, locally, regionally, globally, working with a range of stakeholders, all the more to allow and enable St. Lucia to strengthen its capacity, climate resilience capacity.
Thank you so much, Chanel. For kind of for outlining all of the different things that have gone into that relationship and the coordination, and for speaking about the process. That was so interesting to hear. We are running out of time. So I've just got one more question for Humaira, and then I'm not sure, we might just get some final key takeaways from the panel when we close. But maybe just to finish off this conversation, Humaira, from your perspective, what would be your advice to NAP teams wanting to integrate the education sector into the NAP process? So how can they best work with the Education Ministry?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. I think based on my experience and Pakistan's experience, my first advice would be to treat the education ministry as a core partner and, to take them on board from the very onset and to not have them as a secondary stakeholder. The process really does work best when the ownership is shared from the very start. Now, in Pakistan, as I mentioned earlier, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environmental Coordination has institutionalized a coordination mechanism which brings together all the key ministries, and that includes the Ministry of Federal Education and Professional Training, and its related departments, so the Higher Education Commission and the provincial education departments as well. So this platform allows us to align the adaptation actions with existing education sector plans, their budgets, the curricula, and it ensures that climate priorities are integrated into that particular ministry, in this case, the education ministry's own development goals and agendas rather than, remaining external to it. Secondly, I think it's important to work through the education system's own structures and data. So in our case, collaboration with the provincial education departments has been essential to understand local vulnerabilities, especially, talking about girls' education, and to sort of link the district level adaptation planning with teacher training, curricular reforms, and school infrastructure. Besides this, I think it's important to invest early in joint evidence and in communications. So, co-producing climate risk and vulnerability assessments, which include the education sector, builds credibility and shared understanding. So, for example, in Pakistan's NAP, we're working with partners like the Sustainable Development Policy Institute and the WSP that we've worked with earlier to identify how heat stress, floods, and air pollution affect school safety and attendance. So that evidence kind of helps education policymakers see adaptation as part of their own mandate. And finally, I think maintaining continuous engagement, not one-off consultations is also important. So regular technical meetings, shared monitoring frameworks, communication material tailored for education planners, it all does make a big difference. And like I said before, as the NAP project management unit team, we're currently taking stock of implementation progress through the MOCC national mechanism that has been institutionalized. So these are some of the important things I think which should be kept in mind when planning for education within the NAP. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah, Humaira, and Chanel. This has been such an interesting conversation, and I can see lots of different comments and questions in the chat as well. I know we really haven't got to them, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to pass back over to Chi for the closing. Thank you so much again, for your insights.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to the three panelists. As we're nearing the end of the webinar, and I'm really sorry that we don't have more time for this very important conversation, we'd like to ask the panelists to share one key takeaway message after this conversation and based on the findings of the report. But then while you're reflecting on this key message, we would also like to have a poll among the audience to see what you are interested in, the kind of further guidance that you'd like to see from the NAP Global Network and Save the Children to support the education sector integration in the NAP process. So there will be a poll popping up on your screen. If you could vote on that, and we can see what you would like to hear more in terms of guidance. And then after that, we'll get back to the panelists and their takeaway message. So great, and we'll find out the result in just a moment. Thank you all again also for the questions in the chat, and I'm very sorry that we don't get around to many of these. But if you do have further questions, we will open up our email inbox later if you want to share them with us or the panelists. And now I can see the poll results. There's a lot of interest in education adaptation planning, climate finance, evidently, and also specific case studies for how countries can integrate education in the NAP process. And we'll document these results and follow up with our actions based on what you are interested in. So now we're going to pass back to our panelists for their last takeaway message. Maybe I'll start with Chanel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chi. It is well appreciated how our efforts must continue to be collective. We need to continue being open, speaking with each other, learning from each other, working together. It could never be a siloed efforts. Climate resilience capacity building through climate adaptation efforts, everything that has happened has really happened as a result of the collective making it happen. And in doing it together, we do it better. And so St. Lucia is indeed grateful, recognizing the multiple stakeholders from within St. Lucia, very importantly, thinking of our external partners, thinking of Friends of St. Lucia. That collective intention, that working with intentionality towards strengthening, enhancing our climate resilient capacity has gone a long way. There is still a long way to go, but we are hopeful, recognizing that we're on the right path in terms of that collective and, of course, looking to make our efforts even more coordinated and aligned going forward.
Thank you, Chanel. And it's a very inspiring message for the other countries and ministries working on this as well. Humaira, would you want to share your message?
I think we may have lost Myra, actually. Yeah.
Okay, and in that case, Sarah, would you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I want to just acknowledge that St. Lucia is really a pioneer country for us, developing a specific adaptation plan for the education sector. And while I think that the report, the key takeaway is one of cautious optimism, it sets a baseline for us that now we know the direction of travel, and the vision forward is that every national adaptation plan must include education. There needs to be financing associated with it. But I am optimistic because I see the direction of travel is in the right way. So we have more national adaptation plans with education. There's more climate finance flowing into the education sector. There's more demand for climate education from ministries, from children and youth. So I think that today's webinar was I think a clarion call for us all to continue to push in this direction and ensure that children actually have a chance at a safe and continuous and quality education, despite the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Sarah. We did hear from Humaira's message, actually, so I'll just read out her key takeaway message. As we design our NAPs, it is extremely important to ensure that resilience is not measured by the strength of our infrastructure alone, but by the inclusiveness of our systems, including every child, woman, empower people with disabilities, so they can learn and live safely even if climate goes against us. So I would also like to pass it to Jennifer for your closing message on the next steps from the NAP Global Network and Save the Children.
Thank you so much, Chi. Yeah, I think just to echo, there's obviously so much great progress going on, and from the questions and engagement, feels like this is an area that colleagues want to explore more, which is really great. In terms of next steps, one of the things why we've done the poll today is we do want to support countries, both from a NAP team perspective and an education ministry perspective, to be engaging in the NAP process, integrating education in the NAP process. So we're going to be using the results of the findings from the report to identify some of, as we've done, identify those key gaps, and hearing from country partners and others as around what would be helpful to have more guidance and support on. So that's really the kind of next key step for us, and yeah, really keen to be continuing this conversation with everybody.
Thanks, Jane. So with that, we'll close the webinar. A big thank you again to all of our speakers. If you are interested in reading the report, you can access it through the QR code on the screen. And also we'll share the link in the chat for your reference. We'll share the recording and presentations with the participants of this webinar, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. If you have questions that we're not able to cover today, please feel free to contact us at the email address for the NAP Global Network, which is in the chat box. And thank you so much once again for your participation and for your engaging questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.